Western countries and Russia are holding a series of high-level diplomatic talks this week. Russia has deployed an invasion-sized force along its border with Ukraine. And while the Kremlin says it doesn't intend to invade, American and Ukrainian officials are deeply concerned. Canada and its NATO allies are calling on Russia to de-escalate the situation. So the big question is, what can these diplomatic negotiations actually accomplish? Rose Gottemoeller previously served as Deputy Secretary General of NATO. She is now the Stephen C. Hazy Lecturer at Stanford University's Center for International Security and Cooperation. She is in Mountain View, California. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So the U.S. and Russia, they talked for, I think it was 7 hours, almost 8 hours yesterday, and both sides left the meeting expressing some level of optimism, but you know, Russia keeps demanding the U.S. and NATO make major concessions that just don't seem acceptable. So do you see a path forward here?
It is a bit concerning that out of those talks yesterday, despite the little bit of optimism on the part of Deputy Foreign Minister Rybkov, by today the Kremlin was again repeating the three demands, among them that NATO should no longer enlarge and that NATO should withdraw back to basically its 1997 positions prior to waves of enlargement. So there were a lot of really, I would say, red lines that are no-go zones for NATO. And so that is an issue, I think. I do think that there's some room for negotiation, but it depends on whether the Russians can get beyond those red lines.
You know, there's been some suggestion from analysts that, you know, Russia's demands, it's really just all pretext. They're engaging in these talks basically to show that diplomacy can fail and leaving them with military efforts as really their only option. I mean, what do you think? Is Russia engaging in good faith in these negotiations?
I think Russia would like to see its red lines matched. I mean, indeed, that would be their desire, right? But of course, it's not going to happen. And the NATO alliance, the United States and Canada have been very clear about this from the very outset. And so they understand, I think, that they're not going to get what they say they want. So two options. One, they are going to engage in some kind of continuing negotiation to try to eke out whatever advantage they can from this, but it could be mutual advantage. European security has been tattered in recent years by Russian behavior. So if we can get to a better place on European security through diplomacy, great. The other is the worst case of an invasion of Ukraine.
You know, NATO is probably, I mean, they're not going to roll back to the 1997, levels that Russia is demanding. So what could NATO give Russia here that would be a big enough concession without compromising the security of the alliance to stem off further aggression in Ukrainian territory?
Let me just mention one little irony, and that is in 1997, there were a whole lot more U.S. troops in Europe than there are today. So it was before we took the reductions under the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty. So it's kind of funny and ironic in a way what the Russians are demanding. But I know what they're getting at. They want to go back to earlier days before NATO enlargement. That's the issue. But I think coming back to that, if we can reformulate some of our conventional arms control objectives in a way that makes sense today, because we have already done a lot of reductions in Europe. In fact, the Russians, until they did this big buildup, had also taken reductions in Europe. So I think there is a way that we can negotiate about not only keeping troop levels under control in the borderlands of Europe, between Europe and Russia, but also talk about some constraints on weapon deployments. The Russians have been saying they want constraints on so-called offensive weapon systems. We don't know what they mean by that, but it could be useful for both sides to place some constraints and to have some predictability, some transparency into what the other side is doing in deploying weapon systems in those borderland regions once again. So I do think there's areas of mutual interest. We just have to look for them, and we have to get the Russians to agree that it's worth it for both of us to have reciprocal advantage in these negotiations.
Canada has told the United States is prepared to help with deterrence measures, things like coordinated sanctions or maybe cutting Russia off from like global financial transactions, these sorts of things. How much can measures like that deter Russia? Because they were sanctioned after the annexation of Crimea, and here we are again.
Well, they may deter Russian bankers, but I'm not sure they deter Russian military men or President Putin himself. So that's the issue right now. I think it is at the moment how much pain is Russia willing to absorb on the economic and financial side. They have over years now absorbed quite a bit of pain thanks to sanctions after the invasion of Crimea in 2014 and other suites of sanctions. I think for Putin, he kind of shrugs and says, well, what do I care? A couple more sanctions aren't going to really hurt us. But certain kinds of steps that have been talked about, such as shutting Russia out of the so-called SWIFT system of payments, could really extract some major penalties on the Russian banking and financial system. So we'll see if they do actually have deterrent effect. But they are serious measures, the ones that are being proposed.
You know, one of the core issues in this dispute is Ukraine's ambitions to have membership in NATO. And then Article 5 sort of applies, and you know, an attack on one is an attack on all. And given that reality, and given Russia's posture with Ukraine, how eager do you think the alliance is to actually invite Ukraine to join NATO?
I think the alliance has already expressed itself on this matter way back in 2008 at the Bucharest summit. It said that both Ukraine and Georgia should be on the list of aspiring countries to join NATO. And in fact, they both remain there. Sometimes it takes many years. It can take decades. I like to remind people that it took Spain under Franco. NATO waited around until that dictator had left office before welcoming Spain into the alliance in the mid-1980s. So I think that, NATO is ready to play a patient waiting game. But as far as Georgia and Ukraine are concerned, they are on the list of aspirants. And that's period.
Okay. Rose Gottemoeller, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.